That might have been an objection to my grandfather in those days, but at present, princes as well as private men have too much sense to suffer any impediments from religion in pursuit of great views. Charles Edward Stuart, responding to a criticism of James II's Catholicism. Irish intriguers and French politics. Sir Robert Strange, Orcadian Jacobites' assessment of why the 1745 rising failed. He later reconciled himself to the Hanoverian succession and was knighted. Little inferior to martyrdom itself. Jacobite officer Tom Deacon's description of his fate before being hanged, drawn and quartered for taking part in the rebellion. In 1688, James VII and II had just sired a legitimate son, thus ensuring the continuation of a Catholic dynasty on the thrones of Scotland and England. After a group of MPs invited William of Orange and his wife Mary, James's eldest daughter and hitherto heir presumptive, to invade and become joint rulers, the king fled to France. He attempted to reassert himself in the British Isles with a French-backed force in Ireland at the Battle of the Boyne, but this failed. James VII and II died in Paris in 1701, and Louis XIV recognised his son, the Old Pretender, as the true successor to the thrones of Scotland, England and Ireland. France did not acknowledge the authority of William and Mary, or the newly crowned Queen Anne, in 1702. When Anne died childless after 18 pregnancies in 1714, there was a major succession crisis. Catholics were legally excluded from the throne in England as of 1701 and in Scotland as of 1704. The nearest Protestant heir was the Elector of Hanover, Georg Ludwig, who was the great-grandson of James VI and I, who had married his daughter Elizabeth to Frederick V of the Palatinate. This bypassed 55 Catholic claimants in the process, enraging supporters of the Stuart dynasty and galvanizing opposition to the Union of 1707. The 1715 response to the Hanoverian succession was a French-financed Highland rising, joined by Jacobites in the west and northeast of England. 4 years after the 15 failed, another attempt was made to restore the Stuarts, this time sponsored by the Spanish. It would be over 15 years before Charles Edward Stuart would land in the Western Isles and raise his standard at Glenfinnan in Lochaber in August 1745. Bonnie Prince Charlie, as the son of the Pretender affectionately became to be known, first gave battle to the British government forces at Preston Pans in September, and it was an astonishing victory brought about by the strikingly effective Highland charge of the clans. The Jacobites called it the Battle of Gladsmuir because of a 15th century prophecy that this would be the site of a future confrontation for Scotland's independence. As a consequence of the resounding win, Charles became convinced that the Highlanders could beat 4 times as many regular troops in the field. He returned to Edinburgh and stayed for a time at Holyrood Palace, the Stuart ancestral home in Scotland, where he would have stared at the portraits of all his predecessors, both real and fictional, in the Long Gallery. Charles was well received in Edinburgh, swapping between the tartan and bonnet of Highland dress and the wig and frock coat of Lowland attire to please his future subjects. He was cheerful by nature, but was careful to remain aloof, and did not join in the dancing when balls were held at Holyrood to hail his arrival. The Scottish Jacobites were pleased to have a Stuart prince in their midst after absent kings of the previous century. He did not linger too long, though. Soon the young Pretender's army was on the march again. Stopping off in Manchester to recruit Stuart sympathisers, the Jacobites became a British force of Highlanders, Lowlanders and Englishmen. When they got to Derby, however, they received a rather limited welcome, because they lacked supplies and demanded taxes from the inhabitants to sustain them. In London, only about 120 miles away, an atmosphere of fear reigned, and the press furiously pumped out anti-Jacobite propaganda. They needn't have been so fearful, however, because at the Exeter House Council of War, with no sign of promised French support, the Jacobites decided to turn back. On the retreat march back to Scotland, the ragtag troops got shabbier and shabbier, and by the time they'd pulled back as far as Culloden near Inverness, many of the soldiers were half-starved due to poor logistics and lack of funds. The Jacobites came up with a plan to attack the enemy camp under the cover of darkness and kill the troops in their beds. This scheme failed, as the exhausted Jacobites set off too late, and dawn was breaking as they arrived, thus ruining the element of surprise that nightfall would have granted them. The following day, there was nothing for it but to meet the British army on the battlefield, and so on the 16th of April, Bonnie Prince Charlie remained outwardly optimistic. The Jacobites taunted their foes from the high ground, overlooking boggy moorland, which they thought would hinder the British Army's cavalry and cannon. The numbers were fairly even, at about 7,000 men apiece. However, the Jacobite battle line was angled such as to hamper the effectiveness of the Highland charge, which needed to be swift and simultaneous to work. As a result, they were cut down by British bayonet blades on the end of muskets, and the ranks disintegrated into chaos and general flight. The government troops then pursued the fleeing Jacobites, slaughtering them as they tried to run from the field, and killing around 2,000. Bonnie Prince Charlie fled west and met Flora MacDonald, who used her family connections to obtain the passports necessary to smuggle Charles, disguised as a woman, to safety on the Isle of Skye, for which she was later sent to the Tower of London, but then given a pardon a few years later. London celebrated the Jacobites' defeat, and the officers were tried for high treason and sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered. The Highlands were pacified. All clans, regardless of their allegiance in the rebellion, lost the right to bear arms, and tartan was banned, apart from for soldiers serving in the British Army. Charles eventually escaped to Paris, initially hoping to reignite the cause, which eventually burnt out, with the lack of international recognition of his claim and his dying without a legitimate heir in 1788, 100 years after the Glorious Revolution.